Steve, a $74.5 billion budget, that's several billions more than the last couple of years. This governor ran as a tight-fisted conservative manager, and he wanted to veto a lot of these so-called member projects that didn't go through the budgeting process. There are a lot of those in this budget. He's got a dilemma. You wrote about it. Tell us about it.
Well, I think he has a dilemma, but I think I think the answer is pretty self-evident what he's going to do. First of all, this is the first time in about 5 or 6 years there's been more money to play with. Joe Negron, the budget chairman of the Senate, still pointed out they put $2.8 billion in reserves. They put a $500 million kick into the Florida retirement system to cover some of their shortfall. So there's more than $3 billion right there alone. They're offering teachers a raise. They're giving state employees a raise. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these member projects, aquariums, parks, a $50 million bike trail from one end of the state to the other for all those millions of people who want to ride a bike from St. Petersburg to Titusville. Anyway, I think in the end, the governor is going to do some careful surgical cuts, but he's not going to veto a lot of these projects. Why not? Because we're seeing what I call Rick Scott 2.0 here. We're seeing the Rick Scott that wants everybody to love him. Well, the way you get people to love you is not by vetoing a lot of things. He's already pretty much abandoned the whole Tea Party crowd. He did that over the Medicaid issue. He's lost their support for all intents and purposes. So I think what he does is he will surgically point out examples of where, this doesn't have any statewide benefit, I'm vetoing it, enough to make it look like he's a careful steward of tax dollars, but not so much to antagonize the legislative leadership.
Well, question, is this a winning political strategy for Rick Scott? Will his numbers go up or down by virtue of changing colors a little bit? John, what do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, nothing has made them go up yet. And I don't know if that means that they will never go up. But yeah, he's clearly trying to play toward the middle, and he's trying to be a little bit less hard-edged. And whether that is going to have an effect or not, it doesn't seem to have thus far. The Florida voting public seems to have a image of Rick Scott that was kind of seared into it within the first couple of months that he was elected. And they don't seem to be moving off that. Now, whether teacher pay raises going out there, is that going to win over the support of the Florida Education Association, big teachers union that traditionally is one of the biggest players behind the Democratic candidate for governor? I would tend to think it's not going to win their endorsement of Rick Scott, but maybe they will not fight as hard as Rick Scott hopes, or they'll get a break.
Well, I was going to say, one of the other big stories that we haven't talked about in terms of political dynamic, and that is that Rick Scott lost his lieutenant governor. And she, resigned in the wake of the Internet Cafe scandal when there was a federal and state investigation. And so he has no lieutenant governor right now. And the notion that he is got, moving to the middle and making all these other plays at trying to reinvent himself, as Steve says with this Rick Scott 2.0, is going to be very telling when we see who he's chosen. That's a big dilemma for him as well, because it's been pretty hard, I think, for him to find someone who's willing to run, especially someone who's in an existing office and may have to resign.
I think this does help. I think this does help him a little bit.
Okay.
Not enough to say with any kind of certainty he's going to win a second term. I think he has a difficult set of circumstances for a lot of reasons we'll talk about in future programs, I'm sure. But I think he's sanded off. He's trying to sand off the really rough edges. I mean, the first Rick Scott that came out of the chute in 2011 wanted to cut the education budget by 10%. The Rick Scott of last year reached in and took 3% out of teachers' salaries for a Florida retirement system thing. Teachers haven't forgotten that. You don't make all that up by writing a check for $2,500. But I'd say for Scott, this is a start.
Okay, David, who were the biggest winners in the state budget, in your view?
Well, again, we've already talked about teachers, and I also, so I don't want to belabor that,
right,
but teachers,
yeah.
But also state workers. It's been 7 years since state workers had a raise. They had a bonus in there, a one-time thing, but they haven't had a raise in 7 years, and they're going to raise. So
who would have believed that Republicans would be giving raises to state workers and teachers and...
Steve said why earlier. I mean, there's a lot of money to play with. You know, we got to spend it on something. I mean, you can only put so much in reserves. And so, you know, yeah, this is something, and also alluding back to what Mary Ellen talked about at the beginning, this is something I think, you know, even conservative Republicans in the legislature, because they pay attention to government, they realize that government does things that people care about, and the people who work in government are not all layabouts. And so I think that you know, given their preference, there's probably a lot of Republicans in the legislature who would have liked to have done this before, and now they have the money.
Okay, I think Mary Ellen, I think you wrote about campaign finance reform. Was there a lot of reform in campaign finance?
Well, they did some things that made some cosmetic changes to the way we run our campaign finance system. They got rid of what are called committees of continuing existence, and these were committees that could not benefit a candidate separately, but were controlled by individual candidates, or could be. And they became misused and abused as slush funds for elected officials. So they got rid of those, but instead, in their place, they created political committees that now have more power and heft, and they can collect unlimited amounts of money and spend it in unlimited ways. And that is, I think, one of the untold stories about this session.
Who controls those committees?
They will be controlled by candidates, so you can see, you know, whose candidate is collecting what from whom. But they can also give it to other political committees, and they can give it to other candidates, and that's where we may see some of the hide the ball. The other thing that they did is they changed a 20-year-old campaign contribution cap, which had been at $500 since Lawton Childs put it in, and they now expanded it to $1,000 for any candidate except those who are running statewide. Those candidates, cabinet, governor, and members of the Supreme Court who seek merit retention, can raise up to $3,000 an election. So that cap goes up. It's going to make it a lot easier for candidates for governor and cabinet to collect money.
Anybody follow what happened to Florida's precious environment during this session? David?
Well, it was a good year for the Everglades. There's $70 million in the budget for Everglades cleanup. That's something that they've been working on for years. Not only was there the money in the budget for that, but they reached an agreement fairly early in the session on how to do it. And an agreement that the next day was praised by the Audubon of Florida and the sugar industry. So, you know, they figured out a way to work out a compromise on how to do it. I'm not an expert on all the details, but I think there's a general consensus that it was a pretty good year, certainly for the Everglades.
Remarkably on that point too, a lot of that funds a proposal that Governor Rick Scott, of all people, had proposed some months ago, and Scott did not seem to capitalize on the credit he maybe could have, you know, credited himself with in that. The amount of money that's going into Everglades restoration is fairly significant, and Scott is focused on his two priorities. He's siloed that way, it seems like.
Well, another big issue was during the session, Mary Ellen, was the fact that the Miami Dolphins and other professional sports teams didn't get tax dollars to help rebuild stadiums and so forth, to the tune of $13 million a year, I think was the final bill that never saw the light of day in the Florida House, and there were some people pretty upset with Speaker Will Weatherford about that. You covered that story. Tell us about it.
That's right. It was an interesting dynamic on the night of the session when one of the final bills did not get through the House that would have allowed the Miami Dolphins to make improvements to Sunlight Stadium. The Dolphins owner basically announced that Will Weatherford is at fault, and said that this will follow him through his career. It sounds like kind of a subtle threat that maybe he's going, and then he said he will work and make it a priority of his to fix the dysfunction in Tallahassee, which sort of sounds like raising money and campaigning against everyone who voted against him. This was something that from the start was a huge long shot. Getting taxpayer money and state revenue to pay for a stadium is always a heavy lift in Tallahassee. and especially this year. So it was masterfully lobbied. We saw that they came up with an idea where they started a referendum that early voting had begun even as session was ending. And in spite of that, they weren't able to get the votes. And I think that the question is, did they have the votes in the House? And it was just not allowed to come up by Weatherford. But in fact, I think that Weatherford just did not get the sense that they were deserving of it. So that was a big hit.
I've got about a minute left,
Okay.
but I want to get to kind of yes or no. 2 questions. Steve, will Jeb Bush run for president?
I don't think so. Not at the moment. Nope.
Mary Ellen?
I don't think so either.
Well, I don't think so either.
Yes, I don't think so either.
A unanimous poll here. Jeb Bush, well, you're joining his mother in that poll. Okay, like 15 seconds. Somebody want to say why?
The Jeb Bush that we all covered for 8 years here would have to undergo a level of intrusiveness in his personal life and in his family's life that I think makes him stop and take pause.
All right, starting over here. Will is Marco Rubio running for president? Yes or no?
I think he is running for president, but I'm not sure if he will run for president.
Okay, interesting.
I think he is running for president, but I'm not sure which year he will be actually on the ballot.
Interesting. Mary Ellen?
And I think indeed he is. And we're going to have an earlier a primary that's later that will allow our delegates as a result.
Final question. The national debate on immigration, is that going to hurt him or help him run for president?
It's hurting more than it's helping.